Welcome back. Today, what's on the agenda, what's on the meal plan, is talking all Big Ten football. Today, I am going to be discussing my predictions for the 2022 Big Ten regular season. I'm going to be spending about 2 minutes per team discussing their schedule, my record prediction, my confidence in that team to fulfill my prediction, their strengths, their weaknesses, some key returning players, and even some key departures, depending on if it's appropriate. So it's going to be all Big Ten football, and we're going to start with the West Division, and then move in to the East Division, and then sum it all up at the end like I do in every video. But before you resume watching, I want you to comment who you think is going to win the Big Ten down below, along with a team that you think is going to shock everyone in the Big Ten by either exceeding expectations or performing well below expectations, like Michigan State exceeding expectations this past year and Indiana underperforming them by a mile this past season, just as two examples. So without further ado, let's start out with the Big Ten West and the team that I think is going to win the Big Ten West in the Nebraska Cornhuskers. Nebraska, despite having a 3-9 record, has a lot going for them this year. They got two quarterbacks from the transfer portal in Casey Thompson and Chubba Purdy, who I think are going to make their QB room the best in the West. They return basically their entire linebacker core, which includes Nick Henrich and Luke Reimer. They do miss JoJo Domann, though, I think, to the NFL. They return the entirety of their secondary, except for Cam Taylor-Britt. And another strength that Nebraska could very well have is their shock value. You know, Nebraska being this team that no one is going to really watch out for, to be honest, as they did go 3-9. If they do get some momentum going and they start out maybe with like a 3-0, 4-0 record in their schedule, which is possible, they could get some momentum behind their team. They are not without their questions, though. Their offensive line play and special teams play was atrocious. It was part of the reason that they had that 3-9 record, and they haven't really formed a culture yet, despite Scott Frost being in year 5. I think the offensive line will still be somewhat of a weakness. They seem to have fixed their special teams errors through the transfer portal, bringing in a very well-renowned Furman punter/kicker. And I think that Mark Whipple being the OC and calling the plays will give Scott Frost that time to build a culture in year 5. Nebraska's schedule is as follows. They face Northwestern in a neutral site game, then host North Dakota, Georgia Southern, and Oklahoma and Indiana. So 4 home games in a row. They then travel to Rutgers and Purdue back-to-back, host Illinois and Minnesota, travel to Michigan, host Wisconsin, and travel to Iowa for that last week of Thanksgiving. I think that Nebraska will go 10-2, 7-2 in conference. That Minnesota matchup will determine the West, and I have them being undefeated in heading into that matchup and winning. I think Nebraska's 2 losses are at Michigan, at Iowa, and they will beat everyone else. And I am pretty confident they will win the West and fulfill this record prediction. But a team that I am more confident in to go 10-2 is Minnesota, mainly because Minnesota actually does already have a strong culture instilled in them. PJ Fleck, row the boat. They went 11-2 in 2019. They bring the same quarterback back, and from that year and from 2020 in Tanner Morgan, and despite what happened to Minnesota last year, they dealt with injuries and they had a demoralizing home loss to Bowling Green. They kept fighting on. Minnesota returns Muhammad Ibrahim and Trey Potts at the running back position. They also have a really deep running back room. In fact, one of their walk-ons or maybe scholarship players had a really good year because of those injuries. He was 3rd or 4th stringer, and he's entering the transfer portal to start somewhere else. Minnesota loses all of their offensive line except their center, But I think they're a lot like Wisconsin. They're just going to reload at that position. And with the center, being the leader of the offensive line returning, there's not much to worry about. Minnesota also returns the majority of their linebacker core. And they return O.C. Kirk Shiroka, who coached the 2019 team, to have offensive success. Nonetheless, Tanner Morgan seems to be a weakness for them now. Ever since 2019, he has performed very poorly. He is only slightly better than the atrocity of Graham Mertz that we'll be talking about in a few minutes. And Minnesota doesn't have the same depth that Nebraska and some of these other schools in like the top half of talent do in the Big Ten. I'm more confident in Minnesota, though. I'm very confident that they will be in the top 2 or top 3 of the Big Ten West when the 2022 regular season ends. Their schedule is as follows. Minnesota hosts New Mexico State, Western Illinois, and Colorado. They travel to Michigan State, then host Purdue, travel to Illinois and Penn State back-to-back, then host Rutgers, travel to Nebraska, a game that I think, again, determines the West, host Northwestern and Iowa, and then travel to Wisconsin to battle for the Paul Bunyan axe. I think they lose to Nebraska and Wisconsin to finish 10-2, 7-2 in Big Ten play. Number 3 is Purdue. Purdue being a team that is just so much different from any other team in the West, because when you think of Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, the teams that have had success in the past 3 years, even Northwestern, you don't think of a modern offense. Purdue is the definition of a modern offense. Aiden O'Connell, David Bell, Jackson Anthrop, those three just tearing every opposing defense to shreds, or at least trying to. Their defense was somewhat of a weakness, though, as you find the case with a lot of spread teams or air raid teams, but Purdue they are the black sheep of the West, and I think it will remain that way. Aiden O'Connell does return, and that is certainly a strength. He uses his 6th year. Purdue's entire offensive line basically returns, along with both their starting tight ends. And their wide receiver room, they lose David Bell and Jackson Anthrop, but still expect it to be good. They do have some weaknesses, though. They lose George Karlaftis, the NFL defensive end. They lose their other defensive end and 2 starting linebackers as well. So expect that front 7 to have some struggles. The defense, again, going to be Purdue's weaker side of the ball. Purdue also does not have the greatest amount of depth. They are trying to get some transfers in, but they don't have the same amount of just straight-up talent that some of these other schools do, though. But Purdue, and we've seen this in the past with their upsets, always finds a way. Probably should have put this in as a strength, but they find ways, you can credit the modern offense for this, to shorten that talent gap. Purdue opens up with hosting Penn State, Indiana State, then traveling to Syracuse, hosting Florida Atlantic, then they travel to Minnesota and Maryland back-to-back, host Nebraska, travel to Wisconsin, host Iowa, play at Illinois, host Northwestern, then travel to in-state rival Indiana. I think Purdue goes 8-4, 5-4 in conference, and they lose to Minnesota, Nebraska, Iowa, and they get upset away at the Indiana Hoosiers. I'm about as confident in Purdue's finish as I am in Nebraska's. Not as confident as Minnesota, but still pretty confident. Up next, we got Wisconsin. Wisconsin, this is a very foreign spot for the Badgers. Yes, they went 4-3 in 2020. They went 9-4 this past season. I think they still finished in the top 3, though, in Big Ten West standings. Here, they would be technically tied for 3rd place, but because I do have Purdue beating them, they would be technically number 4. But anyway, they have a lot of strengths to them. Braylon Allen, Ches Malusi is a very good running back duo. Their offensive line, I don't care how many of their offensive line leave, even though offensive line coach Joe Rudolph is left. It's kind of in Wisconsin's culture to have strong offensive linemen, so I expect their O-line to be a strength. And you also have Nick Herbig returning at the linebacker position. Wisconsin's linebackers in basically entire defense under defensive coordinator Jim Leonhard is always good to elite. Nonetheless, like Minnesota, Wisconsin has QB issues. Graham Mertz, as I said before, is terrible. They lose, I think, their entire wide receiver core, including tight end Jake Ferguson. So their offense in general is, outside of the run game, could very well have another down year. And the game plan, until they, hire either a shiny new name at the OC position to call plays, or they prove it on the field, their game plan holds them back. They don't have depth or talent issues, though. Wisconsin has actually been recruiting modestly well. I think it's just the game plan that sometimes holds the Badgers back. Wisconsin opens up against Illinois State, and then they host Washington State and New Mexico State. 3 easy home games in a row, but they travel to Columbus in their 4th. They then host Illinois, play at Northwestern, at Michigan State. They host Purdue and Maryland back-to-back. They play at Iowa and Nebraska back-to-back, and then host Minnesota for that Paul Bunyan's axe. I think they lose at Ohio State in probably a blowout, and then they lose Michigan State, Purdue, and to Nebraska in games that are obviously closer than the Ohio State game. I think they're going to go 8-4, 5-4 in conference, and I am pretty confident that they will fulfill this or finish around that record. Number 5, you have Iowa. Iowa is interesting. They have not had a record as bad as I predict them to have in years. I mean, they had 10 wins in 2019 and 2021, and then that weird COVID year, I think they went 6-2. But Iowa is a team that, again, I'm going to start with weaknesses now because we're at number 5. The QB room is horrible. I mean, only Wisconsin's might be worse, honestly. Spencer Petras and Alex Padilla both return. There's always hope that they could get better, but with Brian Ferentz's OC, they have to get a better game plan. The QBs have to improve. The offensive line loses center Tyler Linderbaum to the NFL draft, and their O-line was plagued with issues last year, even with him being there. Iowa does also have that issue of lack of depth. They don't have Wisconsin or Nebraska's talent, and that could hold them back in certain situations, especially against a team like Ohio State. Their strengths, though, they return tight end Sam Laporta. They return most of their linebackers. They return, I think, the entirety of their secondary. I know for a fact that Riley Moss, the main character of that secondary, is returning. So their defense with Phil Parker it's going to be strong. It's probably going to be even stronger than it was this year. The offense looks to potentially be weaker, though. I think they'll go 6-6, 3-6 in conference. They open up with home games against South Dakota State, Iowa State, and Nevada. They then travel to Rutgers, host Michigan in what's probably going to be a night game, travel to Illinois and Ohio State in back-to-back weeks, host Northwestern, play at Purdue, host Wisconsin, play at Minnesota, and play Nebraska. I think that they will beat their first 3 and all 3 non-conference opponents and then beat conference foes Northwestern, at Purdue in kind of a weird game, and then beat Nebraska. I think that Iowa just has it out for Nebraska, and they're going to beat the Cornhuskers. And I'm not as confident in Iowa going this record because Kirk Ferentz is a good coach. Iowa's proven they always find ways to win, but I don't think you can get away with that offensive ineptitude forever. At number 6, you have the Northwestern Wildcats. Pat Fitzgerald had a terrible year last year, and Hunter Johnson leaves for Clemson, the school that he transferred from originally. I think they return Ryan Helinski and others. They have plenty of options at quarterback, but all did not play well, whether that was due to their talent or just their system. I don't necessarily know, but quarterback seems to be a weakness. They lose, I think Brandon Joseph is his name, the All-American safety from 2020. They lose him in the transfer portal to Notre Dame, and their secondary is thin, and lack of depth really speaks to Northwestern. They're a private school. They can't recruit. They're not necessarily utilizing the portal. this looks to be a hard and tough job, which Pat Fitzgerald always faces, but especially with the team that he had last year entering this year with Brandon Joseph transferring away and just everything. This doesn't look to be Pat Fitzgerald's year. Their strength looks to be, I think, the running back room and the offensive line. They return some good offensive line players, and their running backs, I think all of them return, and I think Evan Hull especially, their good running back, he returns too. So those should be the strengths for the Wildcats. I think they'll go 5-7, 2-7 in conference. They could always surprise, like Pat Fitzgerald loves to do, but I don't think so. They open up against Nebraska in a neutral site game played in Ireland. They host Duke, Southern Illinois, and Miami, Ohio. They then travel to Penn State, host Wisconsin, travel to Maryland and Iowa back-to-back, host Ohio State, travel to Minnesota and Purdue, and end the year hosting Illinois. I think they only beat their 3 non-conference opponents and beat conference foes Maryland and Illinois. So that's Northwestern for you. And now we move on to the last place, the Illinois Fighting Illini. And I am very confident they're going to be last place because Illinois this past season played plenty of super seniors, plenty of them. I mean, Brandon Peters from Michigan. I'm a Michigan fan, so I know his name. They lose, I think, all of their offensive line, and the majority of their starters are gone, basically, and that lack of depth that they have, like most Big Ten West teams, especially Illinois being a smaller school, it's not going to help. They are getting a transfer QB from Syracuse that might help at the QB position, but I'm still expecting it to be below a lot of other teams. They lose both of their, I think they lose their starting wide receivers, they lose a lot of their linebackers, and again, that lack of depth. Their strengths should be running back. I think Chase Brown is his name. It's hard to remember all these names, but he was pretty good. He's from London, England, actually. He's a sophomore. I think he's returning, and they do have a lot of their defensive line production returning as well. So I have them going 4-8, 1-8 in conference. It is going to be a little bit of a down year again, but I do think Brett Bielema is on the right track. Illinois hosts Wyoming, travels to Indiana, then hosts Virginia and Chattanooga before traveling to Wisconsin, hosting Iowa. Then they play Minnesota, at Nebraska, Michigan State, Purdue, at Michigan, and at Northwestern. I think Illinois beats again their 3 non-conference opponents and then beats Iowa, their only conference win, which will definitely be an upset. So that right there is the Big Ten West, and now we are going to move on to the Big Ten East from first to last once again. Ohio State is my number 1 team in the Big Ten East, and there's a lot of reasoning for that. There's a lot of reasons. Their strength is their entire offense, actually. You got wide receiver Smith and Jigba returning, Travion Henderson at the running back position, CJ Stroud at the QB position. They just have elite depth at every position. It's insane. This team's very different from a lot of the Big Ten West teams we just discussed. They're really good. Their secondary, they get some transfers from Oklahoma State that Jim Knowles brought along with him. And Denzel Burke and Ronnie Hickman are starters in that secondary who were really good, and they returned. So expect their secondary to be actually a strength, not a weakness this year. Again, they have that elite depth on their side, and they have vengeance on their side too. They want to make up for the losses to Oregon and Michigan. You can see it in not just the fan base, but in just the staff and mood in Columbus, and I think it's going to help them. Their weaknesses, though, they don't have many of them, just like a lot of teams that finish first or second in their division, but I think the front 7 is going to be a weakness. Their defensive line play has been declining. Their linebacker room has arguably been ruined by the tenure of Al Washington, so they're going to have to, I think, rebuild that. It'll take a year to rebuild that, and they do lose some of their defensive tackles, notably Haskell Garrett. I'm pretty confident that they're going to go 12-0, 9-0 in conference. It seems to be the bounce back here, and there's a lot of reasons that I've already mentioned for that. Ohio State opens up hosting Notre Dame, Arkansas State, Toledo, Wisconsin, and Rutgers, so 5 home games in a row. They then travel to Michigan State, host Iowa, travel to Penn State and Northwestern back-to-back, host Indiana, travel to Maryland, and host Michigan for the game that I think, of course it's the game that I think is going to determine the Big Ten East and who goes to Indy once again, just like this past season. So it's only appropriate to then talk about who I think is going to be number 2, and actually my Michigan Wolverines. I am a Michigan fan after all, and I mention this all the time because I feel like it's appropriate to. But Michigan, the entire offense, I'd say, is their strength. It's not like Ohio State's offense, but their entire offense basically returns, and it's only going to get better. You have an interesting QB battle going on between Cade McNamara and J.J. McCarthy. Running back Blake Corum and Donovan Edwards should be a deadly duo. I think half the offensive line returns, along with both starting tight ends and the majority of the wide receivers. The front 7 for Michigan, they lose a lot, but Junior Colson returns, and you have some backup defensive ends and tackles who did get some playing time, and Mike Elston being hired as well to coach the D-line. I think Michigan's going to reload up there. They return both their punter and kicker, who are really good, and Michigan just has this cohesiveness and new culture about them that seem to be very strong. The loss to Michigan State was really demoralizing. The team didn't give up. They had a lot of comeback wins that you don't normally see from Harbaugh Michigan teams, and just the mood in Michigan feels different. I'm very confident in Michigan and Ohio State to both finish in the top 2. There's an argument potentially for Michigan to beat Ohio State, but Ohio State at this point earns benefit of the doubt, especially with home field advantage. Michigan, nonetheless, their secondary is going to be very thin from the transfer portal and the majority of them leaving to the NFL draft. And Michigan wasn't ranked this past season. They weren't fed the Kool-Aid at all, and they're going to be fed it this offseason. So I, as a Michigan fan myself, am very curious to see if Michigan lets that preseason hype kind of, dampen their season and, kind of overinflate them, if you know what I'm talking about. I think they'll go 11-1, 8-1 in conference. They start out hosting Colorado State, Hawaii, UConn, and Maryland. Very easy opening schedule. Then they travel to Iowa and Indiana back-to-back, host Penn State and Michigan State back-to-back, travel to Rutgers, host Nebraska and Illinois, before traveling to Columbus, which I think will be their only loss. The game will be an undefeated matchup this season, I think. At number 3, we have Penn State. Now, Penn State, they went 7-5 this past year, and it was bad, honestly. Strong start, very poor finish, riddled with injuries. Penn State, to me, seems to be a team that, best described, they are returning a lot, but I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing for Penn State. Penn State's strengths, they have really good wide receivers. Parker Washington and Keandre Lambert-Smith should anchor a very strong wide receiver room. Their secondary, I think they return Jair Brown. They return Anthony Poindexter, who coached the secondary, and he's a very good secondary coach. So expect that unit to be once again strong. And Penn State's recruiting class is very powerful. It's a very strong recruiting class. It includes quarterback Drew Aller and running back Nick Singleton, along with others who could potentially start as true freshmen. Expect to see a lot of freshmen in Penn State's team this year, I think. I don't think they'll have immediate impact to where, they're going to help Penn State win the Big Ten or anything, but this class will definitely show itself and help Penn State in 2023. Penn State's weaknesses, though, include their offensive line, who did not play well this past season. They lose a lot of production. I'm not expecting it to turn around in a year. They also lose I think both of their starting linebackers, and linebackers coach and defensive coordinator Brett Pry is off to Virginia Tech. So you're going to have a new coach, new starters. The linebackers won't be bad. A lot of weaknesses for teams that finish in the top half of their division doesn't mean these units are terrible, but it just means they're going to be the weaker section of the team. And James Franklin also is one of the worst game day coaches, and I think that's turning into a huge weakness for them. I'm pretty confident in Penn State going 7-5, 5-4 in conference. I'm not as confident in that as I am Michigan and Ohio State finishing in the top 2, though. Penn State will open up at Purdue, host Ohio, then travel to Auburn, host Central Michigan and Northwestern. They'll then travel to Michigan, host Minnesota and Ohio State back-to-back, travel to Indiana, host Maryland, travel to Rutgers, and host Michigan State. Penn State will go 7-5, as I've already said. They'll lose at Purdue, at Auburn, at Michigan, and they'll drop home games to Minnesota and Ohio State. Up next at number 4, we have the Michigan State Spartans. Michigan State, they shocked everyone this past season, going 11-2 when their, I think, over-under win total was 4 or 5. They beat Michigan, who won the Big Ten, and they had arguably the best running back in the nation in Kenneth Walker. And if you're a State fan, it really stinks that you lose him. Michigan State's strengths include quarterback Peyton Thorne, who returns, one of the better quarterbacks in the Big Ten. They also have Jaden Reed and Trey Mosley returning at the wide receiver position, so State should have one of the better wide receiver rooms as well. And Cal Haladay, who was, I think, a freshman All-American, nominee, is returning as well, along with some other linebackers. So expect Michigan State to have a very good linebacker room. They should be the backbone of the defense. Michigan State, though, that secondary was, with how good their front seven was this past season, that secondary was one of the worst in the nation. And if you look at Ohio State's secondary from 2020 to 2021, you can't turn around a secondary that bad in a year. It's near impossible. So I think that is going to be once again the huge kryptonite for Michigan State, along with lack of depth. Michigan State, they haven't recruited yet at the level to where they can be completely confident in their depth. If an injury or something happens, it really hinders the team. Another weakness, I would say, would just be a lack of shock value. It's not necessarily a weakness, but State is no longer a team that's going to come out and shock everyone. Everyone's now expecting State to be a top 10 team, so they're going to prepare for them like they're a top 10 team. Michigan State, I think, will go 8-4, 5-4 in conference. They open up hosting Western Michigan and Akron. Then they travel to Washington, host Minnesota, travel to Maryland, host Ohio State and Wisconsin back-to-back, and travel to Michigan and Illinois, host Rutgers and Indiana, and travel to Penn State. I think that Michigan State loses to Minnesota, Ohio State, at Michigan, and at Penn State to finish 8-4, and because of a tie-breaking loss to Penn State, technically 4th in the Big Ten East. Up next, we have the number 5 Rutgers Scarlet Knights. I think Greg Schiano is the right guy, and I think that returning the majority of their defensive line and secondary and special teams, especially kicker Valentino Ambrosio, is very important. They kind of remind me, and someone, a YouTuber I listen to who talks college football, said this: Rutgers is kind of like the Iowa of the Big Ten East. They're very good at defense, special teams, and I expect them to be good this year, but they have weaknesses on offense. The quarterback room, you have Gavin Wimsatt and Noah Vedral, almost forgot his name. They're not going to be, by weakness, I mean as bad as, let's say, Graham Mertz or Iowa's QB room because of Wimsatt, but Noah Vedral was not good. He was outside of the top 100 in ESPN QB rating. They also lose both of their starting wide receivers, I think, including Bo Melton, who was their best. And again, lack of depth. Eventually when Rutgers or any team with lack of depth faces a team like Michigan or Ohio State, toward the end of the game, or normally, not always, you begin to see that team wear down and just the sheer depth and talent of their opponent begin to overwhelm them. Nonetheless, at 6 out of 10 confidence, Rutgers could perform worse and miss a bowl game, or they could go 7-5 or 8-4. I completely think that they can go around there if certain things go their way. Rutgers' schedule includes opening up at a game against Boston College away. They host Wagner, play at Temple, host Iowa, travel to Ohio State, then they host Nebraska and Indiana, travel to Minnesota, host Michigan, travel to Michigan State, host Penn State, and travel to Maryland. I think that Rutgers beats all of their non-conference foes, and they beat conference foes Iowa in what would be at the time an upset. Will beat Indiana and play at Maryland and beat Maryland to go bowling, which would be the second year in a row that the Maryland-Rutgers game determines if Rutgers can go bowling, and I think they'll win it this time. Up next, we do have Indiana. Now, Indiana, you see that 3 out of 10 confidence there means that this record, unlike all the others, is very close to a guess, if anything else. I don't know about Indiana, so maybe I'll spend more than 2.5 minutes talking about them. Their quarterback room, Donovan McCulley, for being a true freshman, obviously has some talent, and they do get Connor Bazelak from the transfer portal, a good quarterback from Missouri. I think he was SEC Freshman of the Year. Correct me if I'm wrong. They return most of their secondary, which will be a strength, and that strong recruiting. They have the best recruiting class in history that Tom Allen is bringing in, and their transfer portal class is second in the Big Ten. I think they're bringing around 10 transfers in. They lose a lot in the transfer portal too, but Indiana does have some strengths going for them. Their weaknesses, though, I think overwhelm their strengths, despite their very impressive resume for strengths. Their weaknesses, they lose Ty Fry-Fogel and the majority of their wide receiver core. Trench warfare means just in the trenches in general. Both their D-line and O-line look to be weaknesses. Their O-line was horrible this past season, and they lose the majority of their D-line. And once again, because of the fact that they've really only recruited strongly for a year and they're losing a lot in the portal, they, like most teams in the Big Ten compared to the top, have a lack of depth that can prevent them from going certain places. I think Indiana goes 5-7, 3-6 in conference, but I could see them going even lower, 3-9, but I could also see them shocking people and going 8-4 and possibly, beating some teams that by no means they should beat. They open up against Illinois, Idaho, and Western Kentucky before traveling to Cincinnati, Nebraska, and then they host Michigan and Maryland, travel to Rutgers, host Penn State, travel to Ohio State and Michigan State back-to-back, and host Purdue. Indiana will start out 3-0, beating Illinois, Idaho, and Western Kentucky, but they'll fall to Cincinnati, and with that very tough Big Ten schedule, they'll only beat Maryland and Purdue. Purdue will definitely be an upset. We'll finish 5-7, 3-6 in conference, but like I said, I could totally see them going anywhere from 3-9 to 8-4. They have a wide range of values. They're a very volatile team. This record is closer to a guess than an actual educated prediction. I don't know about Indiana, to be honest. And last, but certainly not least, Maryland. Well, in this case, it would be least. They're the only team that won't beat a conference opponent. Maryland has just the transfer portal, Mike Loxley as a head coach, the lack of depth, and the entire defense. It was one of the worst defenses in the Big Ten. If not for their offense having good production with quarterback Taulia Tagovailoa, their defense probably would have been the worst in the Big Ten by points allowed. And they lose half their linebacker core and 5-star talent Terrence Lewis in the transfer portal. They just don't have depth. They've been recruiting pretty nicely under Loxley, but again, the transfers, especially outgoing, kind of cancel that. Mike Loxley as a head coach as well has a proven track record of losing. The 6-6 season fulfilled exactly what I thought they would this past year, but they lose so much, and when you lose a lot, and excluding the head coach, you kind of have similar talent to your surrounding schools, and then have inferior coaching, I have to pick you to go last. Their strengths include the wide receiver core and QB room. Talia Tagovailoa, I think, is returning, and you also have wide receivers Rakeem Jarrett and Dante Demas. Maryland's wide receiver room and QB room should be very strong, but I just think the defense and Mike Loxley's coaching, along with some discipline issues that Maryland had, will kill them in the end. This team once again could go bowling, though. The bottom half to bottom 2/3 of the Big Ten East is kind of a mystery. I'd say more of a mystery than the West to a certain degree. Maryland opens up hosting Buffalo, playing at Charlotte, and hosting SMU. Then they travel to Michigan, host Michigan State, host Purdue, travel to Indiana, host Northwestern, play at Wisconsin and at Penn State back-to-back, host Ohio State and Rutgers to close out the year. They'll open up 3-0, but I think they're non-conference foes, and this is the case with a lot of the Big Ten. Outside of Cincinnati for Indiana, all the conference foes have severe mismatches. The non-conference foes do. The Big Ten, once again, is one of the stronger conferences. They normally perform well against their non-conference opponents. So Maryland will finish again 3-9, 0-9 conference, and I have modest confidence that they'll do this. Much better than the confidence I had in Indiana. And that right there is my predictions. Once again, I think that in the East, Ohio State's going to win the East at 12-0, followed by Michigan at 11-1, Penn State at 7-5, and Michigan State at 8-4, but both having the same conference record as I already explained. Penn State has the conference tiebreaker. Rutgers will finish 6-6 and 5th in the East, Indiana 5-7 at 6th, and Maryland at 3-9 at 7th. In the West, Nebraska, I think, is your Big Ten West champion at 10-2. Minnesota will also be 10-2 and 7-2 in conference, but they lose at Nebraska, and that'll be the tiebreaker that sends Nebraska to Indy. Purdue will be 8-4, 5-4, and finish 3rd. Wisconsin will be 8-4 and 5-4 as well, but losing to Purdue will create a tiebreaker in favor of Purdue. Iowa will be 6-6 and finish 5th. Northwestern will be 5-7 and finish 6th, and Illinois will finish in last place of the West with a 4-8 record. Later in the off-season, as we know more, I'll make another video that is exactly the same as this, with probably some greater detail, greater knowledge, more confidence in my predictions, and it will include a segment predicting the Big Ten championship game as well. But that's all I have to say for this video. If you liked it, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, comment your thoughts down below, and click that notification bell so you can watch more of my videos. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys around.